Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. This is John Morris talking to you from the Alaska Regional Office for the National Park Service. I'm appearing on screen as Jim Pfeifenberger today, but I'm obviously not Jim. I've been asked to sit in Jim's absence since he had a medical issue with family member that had to go out of town to Seattle. So I'm happy to sit in for him and help to moderate today's webinar from the Pacific Ocean Education Team, and happy to welcome our guest speaker, Mr. James Delgado. For those of you who are new to these webinars, it's very easy to interact with us. Just simply type in your chat box there, question box at the bottom of your control panel. You can make comments or ask questions at any time, and I'll be monitoring that. We'll, since there's a number of people that normally log in for audio quality, we normally leave everybody in listen-only mode, but depending on how things go during the Q&A session after the presentation, we can certainly open up and maybe have more of a conversation with our presenter. Today's presentation is going to be recorded, and the video and a visual presentation will also be available on the website afterwards, and so we'll get those from Jim Pfeifenberger and make that available to folks if needed afterwards. So without any further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Mr. James Delgado, who's the Director of Maritime Heritage for NOAA's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, and based in California there. And we're going to get a nice, looks like an explanation about some cultural maritime landscapes. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, James. Take it away.
Thank you. It's good to be at least virtually on the West Coast. I'm calling you all from Silver Spring, Maryland, which is NOAA's headquarters. Though I will confess I am an original West Coaster, born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. Lived most of my life on the West Coast, be it San Francisco, outside of Portland, Oregon. Grew up a bit in the Puget Sound area and spent 20 years in Vancouver, British Columbia. So while I might be on the East Coast, I guess I know where my heart is, and it is out there in California. By way of a little bit more of an introduction, NOAA is very pleased to partner with a number of folks around the country through the Marine Sanctuary System, and we are very proud to partner very particularly with the National Park Service at Olympic Coast, Cordell Bank, the Gulf of the Farallones, and Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuaries, and with the national parks there. Over the last few years, as we've been looking at how best to not only manage the resources that we have out there on the water, even though they come right up to the shoreline, we've been struck with the need to project more awareness of the resources, to share the tremendous stories that we know exist, but also try to engage the public in a way that makes the seemingly vast and unfathomable ocean relevant, exciting, and to give people a better sense of how it relates to them. I think, indeed, one of the biggest issues we faced in certain communities is the sense that perhaps the ocean is there to be looked at, appreciated, they understand fishing or people traveling on it. But other than that, it's not all that relevant, and I think in some communities, they wonder how it really relates to them. In looking at that, and also in trying to balance all of the different competing needs and views that are out there with various shareholders or stakeholders, we finally came to a concept that maritime archaeologists and historians have been embracing, which isn't that different, in fact, from what many of you on land have been doing in terms of cultural landscapes. But in this case, we're looking at the maritime cultural landscape, and it's not, as I said, all that different from what people are practicing and doing on land. I recall when I was in the National Park Service in the 1970s and was working in the San Francisco Bay Area, we began to look at one area at Point Reyes National Seashore, a collection of historic ranch buildings in the Olimo Valley. More and more, as more than just a National Register nomination of individual buildings, but actually, heaven forbid, the different hillscapes, the paths that had been worn, the roads, the plantings, the trees, the fence lines, the whole 9 yards, which at that stage, I have to confess, drove the superintendent a little crazy. But over time, superintendent and others came to realize that by looking at all of these aspects of this layer cake of history, as well as how people had interacted with the environment, that there was strength in that. And in particular, it brought folks into the picture that otherwise might not have been there. And so in that vein, we've been doing this with the maritime cultural landscape. And where it's particularly taken off in the last while has been in the work we were doing as we begin to assess the possibility of expanding in Northern California. Some of you may be aware that Congress had been looking at the idea of creating a marine monument off of the Northern California coast in and around Mendocino. Those discussions finally have centered on a more administrative process that would have us look to expand the existing Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary out there, which is a fair chunk. It stretches from Monterey Bay up past the Golden Gate up into Marin County, wraps around and joins up to Point Reyes National Seashore, goes into Tomales Bay, and then up to Bodega Bay. And this new expansion, if it were to happen, would take it all the way up to Point Arena, so a fair chunk of coast, and an area that, when you look at it, is more than just a stretch of coastline and a fair amount of offshore water, but an area which is particularly rich in human history. And so in grappling with how best to deal with that history, and also in a way to try to use that history to get people to care, to be interested, to understand why such an area might be considered for a marine sanctuary or, any type of monument or park, we've started to characterize it as a vast maritime cultural landscape. And what I thought I'd do is just walk through a little bit of that today to give you all a sense of how we've begun to understand this section of the coast. I think, as you can see, it's been termed the Redwood coast. And that's because this is an area that geographically is quite dynamic. You have a huge upwelling off of the Pacific that comes into play here, and that upwelling creates unique environmental conditions. The coastal fogs are one aspect of that, but also that upwelling brings a fair amount of marine resources, particularly fish, into the area. And for that reason, this area is not only rich in fish, it's rich in marine mammals, it's rich in the great white sharks that live out there, it's rich in marine birds, and those resources not only have been the means by which this area has developed naturally, but those resources have been one of the aspects that have attracted human beings for thousands of years. That rich coastal environment as well, particularly with the fogs, gave rise to the vast forests of redwood trees, which would become a shelter not only for life, but would be harvested to a certain extent by the Native Americans, but also which would finally play a powerful role in the 19th century and into the early 20th century as the Pacific Coast lumber industry picked up. And this otherwise rugged, seemingly inhospitable and inaccessible coast was developed with ports called dog-hole ports, such as you see in the one image here, which were very shallow, dangerous spots to get into, but you could take a small vessel in, anchor it up, and with wire and wood chutes, literally send that lumber that had been milled in coastal settlements down to the water to be loaded on these ships. Called a dog-hole port, by the way, because they were so small, the mariner said, that a dog could barely have enough room to wiggle into the hole and then wiggle on out. So, let's go. In looking at the maritime cultural landscape of the Redwood Coast, a couple things sprang to mind for us, and one of those was the question of the first people to come here. One of the aspects that I don't have a slide of, but which I'd like to start by talking about, is the fact that this is a drowned coastline from the last ice age. And if you look at the last glacial maximum, about 21,000 years ago, and you continue that through time, you quickly realize that the continental shelf, as it stretches out past the existing shoreline, was dry land. And dry land in which we were pretty sure human beings had to have come into contact with. We certainly know from other areas around the country, particularly on the East Coast, that human beings were in those areas. I see we have Susan Langley on the line from the state of Maryland, and off of shores out here, prehistoric sites have been found through dredging and through trawling, and University of California is just about to publish a book, if it hasn't come out already, come to think of it, that talks about some exciting discoveries that raise the possibility of people having traveled over across the Atlantic following the edge of the ice during the last glacial maximum. As to what remains on this coastline, what might be down there, has yet to be looked at in any great detail, because we haven't done a lot of survey off the coast looking for these things. But some digs at Channel Islands National Park going down into the water clearly show a progression and a use of marine resources that goes back more than 10,000 years ago and actually disappears into the water level. And at Montague Harbor in British Columbia, in the islands there in the Inside Passage, an excavation on the seashore extended down well underwater and found a continuous cultural deposit, and beneath the disturbed seabed, an undisturbed level of forest floor that went back several thousand years. So one of the things that we've been talking about as we've begun to meet with folks in the community, and as we've begun to grapple with this as an agency, has been the very clear thought that what is now water was once land, and it was potentially a highway by which human beings migrated. Over the past several thousand years, as the ice melted and the sea level rose, that coastline changed dramatically. And in this, what we may be finding, ultimately, is movement of settlements as human beings adopted to climate change. And that's a pretty exciting one for us, certainly being attached to the Ocean Science Agency as part of NOAA. We're keenly interested in human adaptation to climate change. It's not just a historical question, actually. It's one that's going to be increasingly an issue for all of us over the next while, with sea level rise coming as a result of climate change. So how our ancestors dealt with this in the past is going to be pretty important for us, particularly if we can begin to trace those settlements. For those of you in California, a clear sense of how dramatic that change is the sense, or the fact, that the Farallon Islands, 26 miles outside the Golden Gate, mark the original coastline of the coastal mountains, and at the mouth of a huge river that flowed through a valley that is today San Francisco Bay. That river mouth was a logical place for human settlement, and a few hundred feet down, preserved even through the inundation and the movement of the level and the resultant waves having churned things up. We still think there's a possibility that something may be there, though it might be buried beneath settlement. So in that, what the first bit of the maritime cultural landscape going back thousands of years, what we are seeing, by the way, in Sonoma and Mendocino counties are archaeological sites on land, particularly on hillsides, are areas that do reflect early migration of people. And Brett Partman from California Parks and Recreation's excavated a site, huge stones right on the existing coastline, which look to be rubbing spots for mammoths and other animals, and a fair amount of stone flakes indicating prehistoric hunters waited there and sharpened their weapons in anticipation of these animals coming through during the Ice Age. So hopefully, in that case where there's smoke, there's fire, and in time, if we continue to survey and work out there, we might find more of that. What's also clear, as our anthropologists and archaeologists have started to look at this area, is that there's a logical path to follow if you actually follow the coastline then or now. And as this one slide shows up at the top, that coastline and that marine inshore environment is very rich in food. The Coast Salish people of British Columbia have a saying, which is that when the tide goes out, the table is set. And certainly that would be the case here. So imagine, if you will, even thousands of years ago, as we archaeologically grapple with how quickly human beings moved into North America, whether we look at that from the Clovis period, about 10,000 years ago, or even farther back, and we are starting to see sites that predate Clovis to 18,000 years, if not 20,000. And people moved quickly. There's a site off the coast of Peru that's 18,000 years old. So that means that, let's say people came into the New World even, 18,500 years ago. They've moved a fair amount and fast. And if we think that they're just walking, it's hard to imagine larger groups of people moving that quickly. But if you use boats, you can move very fast. If you understand the water, it's not a difficult task. And most of the craft in those times would likely have been skin craft, easily patched, maneuverable, and with renewable ability to make more as you continue to hunt and gather. and you would never go hungry if you harvested the resources in those kelp beds or in the tide pools or fished. That practice continued well into the modern period, and the other way in which we're grappling with this is looking at the later native populations and the existing populations that still are in these areas. Certainly, as you see in this image, following European contact, the Pomo and others on this coast were subjected to a rather intense change as a result of the arrival of Europeans and the ultimate settlement of the area after the California Gold Rush. That included extermination, it included disease, it included people being gathered up and put into the Spanish mission system, and it also included change over time through intermarriage with the other folks in the region. And yet, for all of that, a number of these folks have persisted, still understand and practice their traditional culture, such as the elder you see here on the beach gathering kelp. And in understanding and recognizing that over time we have perhaps overlaid a different sense on the coast and on the waters by putting different place names on, by continuing to practice only that and not go back and talk to the communities and talk about their views of the water, their views of sacred parts of the water, their views of the water as a resource for food, and their place names for it is also going to be pretty key. One of the areas that we've started to grapple with this more strongly is on the northwest coast, where in partnership with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, we're working with 3 separate tribes right now on the coast, the Yurok, the Grand Ronde in Oregon, and the Makah on the Olympic Peninsula, to have them tell us what they see is the maritime cultural landscape, and not capture that in some database or on a set of charts or maps or in a GIS that the government controls, but rather their culture, their view of the oceans, their view of how these work for them and how they have interrelated with that marine environment. So we're doing that, and it's going to be interesting to see how it works over time. But in the process of looking to create an expanded sanctuary, we're beginning to talk to folks who hitherto have not been at the table with us, like the Pomo and the other folks that live on this coast, some of whom have relocated away from the coast but still have strong memories and culture that relates to it. I talked a bit about the whole idea of the Europeans and their interaction with the natives, but the other thing that we've seen with this section of the coast is the fact that the ocean here was not only a highway for people in prehistoric times, it was a highway for people in more historic times. And where that really comes through, I think, dramatically, is when you look at the European arrival on the coast. And that story begins after Cortez's conquest with initial Spanish probes and exploration of the coast. It continued with the development of the Manila galleon trade in 1565 when this coast was encountered. Landmarks were named and marked, Cape Mendocino being one of them. All of those spots became well known as marks on the road to the Spanish navigators and then ultimately for explorers from other nations that followed. So in addition to Cape Mendocino shown here, you see the vessels of both Spain and Great Britain, early fur traders from the United States. All of these people knew this coast well, and their place names, at times overlaid over the existing native names, remain, such as Mendocino or Punta de Arenas or today's Point Arena, and so on and so forth. Even Point Reyes on that coast, originally named for the feast day of the Three Kings, the Punta de los Tres Reyes, still persists in having that originally bestowed name, albeit a little anglicized. Incidentally, for those of you in California, understanding that so many of the place names there still remain in the Spanish language, it's fun to note that while they're still somewhat Spanish, it's changed a bit. Some of my favorites are the town I was born in, San Jose, which is really El Pueblo de San Jose del Rio de Guadalupe, or El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora de Los Ángeles del Rio Porcancula, or today, L.A. The first Europeans to come and settle in this area and on this Redwood coast were more, of course, than just the Spanish or the occasional English visitors like George Vancouver, or French explorers like Duflo de Mafoy or the Comte de la Perouse. The Russians came here in response again to the maritime resources. Moving out of Alaska and down the coast, at first to establish an agricultural settlement on the coast to take care of the folks in Sitka and beyond, the Russian America Company soon realized that this coastline, which had originally been a source of food for the Native American communities, also was a habitat that was very favored by sea otters. And those pelts were a tremendously valuable commodity, especially given the interest of the Chinese in acquiring them, something that Captain James Cook's sailors had discovered on his third and final voyage to the coast in 1778, when the men traded with the natives for otter pelts and then found that they could make 1,000-fold or more when they sold some of those pelts when they landed on the coast of China. John Ledyard, an American who sailed with Cook, wrote an account of this, and this inspired a literal Russian soft gold, and that was how they characterized these pelts, which saw a number of nations vie for control of the maritime fur trade. That fur trade stretched from the coast of Alaska all the way down to the mouth of San Francisco Bay. And the Russian America Company, when it established its colony on the California coast at Colonia Rosiva, or Fort Ross, quickly saw that they could also develop other entrepôts in addition to the agriculture that would serve as a means by which these pelts could be gathered. So working with native communities, particularly Aleut from up north, but also some of the local Kashaya Pomo, these guys regularly harvested the coast for the sea otters and shipped them back to the mother country, and participated actively in a triangular maritime trade. Fort Ross today, a California state landmark, is a reminder of that time, but also on this coast as well, the site of the original Russian sawmill, the wreck sites of Russian vessels that engaged in the trade, a Russian seaport at Bodega Bay itself, as yet very scarcely archaeologically documented, and also a variety of Russian place names which formerly existed on this landscape and which still remain in place, at least in some manuscript charts. Ultimately, this coast was settled, though, by the United States following the discovery of gold in California and the rise of San Francisco and other communities. As gold was an important part of the economy and inspired the creation of these vast cities such as San Francisco or Sacramento, it also saw folks coming to California who decided to put down roots and to stay. And California's rich resources, whether it was developing the interior valley for agriculture or the Napa and other surrounding areas for wineries, was one part of that. But there also was this timber that I started talking about, these vast stands of redwood, which could be logged, albeit with some difficulty, on an otherwise inaccessible coast. There was no railroad up here. There was no road up here until literally the late 19th century. So as the lumber trade got started in 1850, 51, 52, and beyond, what these folks realized they could do was to land folks on the edge of the forest. They could log out an area, create an area by which they could roughly hew and mill their timber, and then at these various inlets and spots where it was safe enough, they could start to create these dog-hole ports. And there were dozens of these, some of which became more established coastal communities, others which literally were a way stop on the ocean highway where vessels would come in. Tie up, as you see in the images here, the lumber would be slid on down these lumber chutes, loaded into the holds, and off they would go. In time, the trade inspired the construction of a large fleet of vessels, most of them two-masted schooners, like you see at the bottom of the picture there, that were built literally not from the redwood, but from the Douglas fir that grew on the coast. A powerful trade, and one which at a certain stage, let's say about 1887, at that point, say in the fall of 1887, there were several hundred two-masted schooners working the coast, most of them plying in the lumber trade, but also delivering other commodities such as produce from coastal farms. The chart is an interesting one, and I'm going to come back and talk about these in a bit, but these are manuscript charts made by the United States Coast Survey as they began to develop coastal charts for safe navigation. A number of these, of course, survive in archives. They were the original surveys that were done in advance of the more, shall we say, detailed but not to this level of detail published charts for mariners. What we like about these as we've begun to look at them in the archives and copy them is that the detail not only includes ownership of pieces of property, but it plots coastal roads. You can see in the Fort Ross Cove area the outer mooring buoy and the chute from which the lumber would be loaded. And you can also see in pencil, very nicely, what the Coast Survey guy has done is Mendocino Cove. In this, he's actually documented the original Pomo name for the spot. And in that, I think we see one of the strengths of the landscape approach. So many times, I think, we view history as a progression. We view it, if it's a layer cake with one layer covering the over, just like the Maya with the pyramids. And what we see in this kind of an approach is that rather than take it linearly or two-dimensionally, we look at it in a way in which it is three-dimensional and in which there is no hierarchy in this. Fort Ross Cove was Meteni. It was known to the Russians by a different name. It was known to the Spaniards by a different name. And in this, particularly in the study of place names, whether they're officially recognized on a chart or if they're just what people know of an area or know an area to be or what they call it, all of that is valuable and all of that is important to reflect and to record and to recognize, because in that we're not wiping out or erasing one people's name for it. We're looking at all of it, and in this, by coming back and putting all these names back onto the maps, at least as best we can in these studies, we're able to connect people back to the water and show that they were relevant and perhaps have that be relevant for them too. The maritime landscape of this coast includes not only the stuff on the water, but everything that's interrelated to that. That includes, of course, the aids to navigation, past and present, the lighthouses on this coast, often in dramatic settings like the Point Arena light, both its original, which was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake and then rebuilt, or the Point Cabrillo light that you see here, the Point Reyes light. Each of them their own unique sea mark or landmark are part of that maritime cultural landscape, and this is where maritime culture comes ashore. And in that, and in recognizing the interconnectedness of all of this, I think we also draw other folks in and begin to make coastal communities more aware of the waters off of them as more than just something out there or the way by which ships passed. Of course, these lighthouses were put there because this is a tough and dangerous coast, and shipwrecks are many. We've documented close to 200 historic wrecks just in the stretch of the Redwood coast. If you look at this map and you see Bodega Head and its area, then you follow it up to Point Arena, and then you can see Cape Mendocino. In that section, that's where we've counted some 200 wrecks alone. There's probably another 100 or more just down the coast to the mouth of San Francisco Bay, and then if you follow it down past Monterey to Point Sur, a few hundred more. Clearly this is a bad patch of the road, and those shipwrecks on this coast, which represent all different periods and different trades and activities, are an important part of the maritime cultural landscape. One of the other things that those shipwrecks, and that doesn't just mean those that are still sitting on the bottom, but everybody that had a bump, a scrape, a stranding, or an accident that were ultimately pulled off, or where people had to be rescued, it also inspired the creation of lifesaving stations. The United States Lifesaving Service came into being in the 1870s. Their stations were many on the East Coast, but more slowly developed on the West Coast. But in this Redwood Coast area, you have a station at Point Arena, such as you see here on 10 Mile Beach at Point Reyes. And from these stations, the surfmen would watch, wait, and when a ship came ashore or when word came, out they would go, at first in road craft, a vessel wasn't wrecked on the beach, ultimately in motorized craft. Today, of course, their activities are incorporated into the U.S. Coast Guard, and as we all know, the Coast Guard have a wide array of modern craft and helicopters and rescue swimmers to deal with this. But the maritime landscape reflects not only the ongoing activities of the Coast Guard of today, but the lifesavers of the past. At Point Reyes in particular, the National Park Service not only marks and maintains the site of the lifesaving station, but on a nearby hillside, swept by the wind with cypress otherwise on a lonely coast, are the graves of those surfmen who died in service, either through disease or those who drowned in accidents, either in training or trying to save others. The landscape in that way is also diverse and reflects, again, our interaction as human beings with the maritime environment, and a common reflection made by both the lifesavers in the old service and the Coast Guard of today, which is you have to go out, but you may not come back. Talking a little bit more about shipwrecks, and now coming back to the issue of charts, one of the most powerful resources we've begun to find are these manuscript T-sheets that exist, as well as other things in the archives, both in the American Geographical Union and the National Archives and some of our own NOAA archives. What we see, and in this case, we're just going to look at the mouth of the Golden Gate here from just down by Point Montera up to Point Reyes. This area, seen in satellite, and then in this chart done by the Coast Survey, includes a notation made up to that point of the various shipwrecks that were noted by the Coast Survey, and because they, like us, work for the Department of Commerce, what the cost was, both in terms of stranding as well as total losses. What's the economic damage done here? A lot of this work, and you can see it in this zoom-in, was the result of this really talented fellow, George Davidson, who was the first superintendent of the U.S. Coast Survey out on the West Coast. Davidson had an active interest, not only in just charting this area, but understanding it. That included not only taking deep water soundings and samplings and looking at the marine life, but also documenting shipwrecks, and also trying to assess them, to note in their notebooks and on their manuscript T-sheets landing spots of early explorers, place names that were known in the past, including the native place names. All of that, absolutely important to him. What I like as an archaeologist is that he also, as we found as we started to survey this, is he had a darn good idea as to where these shipwrecks actually happened, and we have used these to go back and relocate some of these wrecks. He also, in another manuscript chart shown here that we found in the archives, not only lists them, but he begins to look at them in terms of clusters and how the maritime landscape in particular, through its various, I guess, natural causes, the fog, prevailing currents, sandbars, and the rest, how wrecks tend to cluster around certain areas. One of the things I like about this approach is that not only does it give us a better sense of how these people understood the marine environment, it also begins to lump and cluster the data in a way so that we, as the managers, can also focus some of our survey effort. Here, for example, you can see right off the north shores of the Golden Gate just a section of ships that were damaged, those that were lost, and how much that all cost. And by focusing on that tiny an area, when I was with the National Park Service and with Golden Gate National Recreation Area many years ago, we were able to start surveying in this area and finding not only, by the way, the ships that had totally wrecked, but in some cases, when these vessels were badly damaged, when things were cut off or dropped over the side, we were also finding traces of those too. I have a question that just came in from Brendan about whether or not we and NOAA would be interested in cooperatively pursuing a Russian-American heritage trail or area centered on sites in Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, and in Russia, and the answer is absolutely yes. We'd be happy to work with anybody and everybody on such a thing. Coming back to those charts as well, one of the other things I like about it is the coast surveyors being inveterately curious guys, and realizing that it wouldn't make it on the actual final chart, but just the same, they wanted to document what was there. Here you see the 1862 wreck of the clipper ship Sea Nymph just off the beach of Point Reyes, off of 10 Mile Beach now, and in waters that are part of the national park boundary, but also within the waters of the sanctuary where we overlap. Sea Nymph was built to actively work the California trade. Remember that before the Transcontinental Railroad, you could only go to California by sea. You either had to go around the Horn, or you could sail down or steam down to the Isthmus of Panama, hike the 48 miles over, and get on another vessel on the Pacific side. That voyage could take an average sailing ship several months. It would take, even by way of Panama, several weeks. But the clippers could do it pretty fast. The record, 89 days, not bad. And I try to remember that incident every time I get frustrated when I'm out on the highway or caught in rush hour traffic. These clippers became famous because of the speed at which they could move. And as the 1860s moved on, while they proved to be economically not the best, I mean, sure they could move fast, but they couldn't carry a lot. So ultimately where the clipper ships ended up going was becoming more like the UPS or the FedEx of their day. If you had a high value, high risk cargo that you needed to move, the U.S. mail, specie, treasure, things of that sort, perishables that you could get a high price for, you loaded them in a clipper ship and sent them on out there. Sea Nymph got caught in the fog and sailed right up onto the beach, and close in to the shore, just past this low-tide surf line, not only do you see the wreck of Sea Nymph, but you also see a little building, and that is a temporary shed built by the guys that were trying to salvage the cargo of the Sea Nymph. Another notation, and one of the nice things about the maritime landscape is that the names that are there reflect more than just what we think about them or what they look like. In some cases, the landmarks have names from the ships that were lost there. And so here, George Davidson has marked at Noonday Rock off the Marin County coast, where the clipper ship Noonday wrecked in 1852. And as you can see, it's a total loss of ship and its cargo, a value of $400,000 in its time. That's millions of dollars today. And that disaster, marked not only by the ongoing recording of and the naming of this place as Noonday Rock, but the wreck of the ship itself at the base of the rock as a modern archaeological resource. The landscape is diverse. It's all sorts of things. As I said, it's one that even as you get closer to larger cities, and in this case you have Lincoln Park in San Francisco. Lincoln Park today is a golf course, but in its time, previously out there in the windswept sand dunes outside the gate, it was one of the city's burying grounds. And it was a place where Chinese immigrants, lepers, the poor, and also merchant sailors were all buried. San Francisco passed legislation in the early 20th century to forbid the burial of humans in the city limits, and every graveyard was supposedly emptied as a result and moved to larger cemeteries outside San Francisco, Colma, San Francisco being one. But, and in this case, a number of the tombstones were moved away, and yet some still remain in the park with the golfers moving around them. You can see one grave marker here from the original sailors' part of the cemetery. From time to time, erosion on the coast will wash out a section where they've cut a road, and coffins will still tumble out, indicating not everybody got moved. But again, all part of that maritime landscape, and in this case, were a number of these sailors who were working this coast and ended up getting sick or injured and dying at the Marine Hospital in San Francisco, or being caught and drowned in one of the wrecks on the coast and being brought here would end up later, leaving their bones. That maritime landscape, by the way, is one that remains an active part of modern culture. Today we reflect that not only with modern charts, but how we mark, measure, and work with this marine environment. That includes ongoing fishing activities, the ways by which we will do something like the America Cup race and lay out a course and sail at for the races and then take it up, the way markers that we put in terms of buoys. All of this reflects this maritime landscape. And so while seemingly the ocean is unmarkable. I think hopefully what you're beginning to see is that it can be, not only conceptually grappled with, but we do, particularly with modern technology, we do mark and delineate human spaces in the natural environment. Ultimately for us, I think why we like maritime cultural landscapes is that it ultimately pulls us back to what we as archaeologists or historians or as educators really are focusing on when we look at what has transpired here before, and that's people. In understanding how this marine environment has shaped a coast and a culture through different periods and with different cultural groups being there, in understanding how we have had an impact on that environment, either by looking at historic patterns of fishing or how we have settled the coast in certain areas, how we have accessed those resources. In all of this, I think we begin to understand that as big and as vast as the sea is, as well as the earth, that ultimately it is a human space and a human place. And for us in NOAA, as we look not only to help preserve cultural resources, but also look at natural resources, the realization that is finite, as huge as the ocean is, it's finite. And those resources are finite too. And in all of this work, as we look at dredge sites, spoil sites, the dumping of 40,000 barrels of nuclear waste off of the California coast, again, all part of that maritime cultural landscape, we realize that human beings do have the capacity, unlike any other animal, to not only alter their close-in environment, but the larger environment in which they live. And we are having an effect on the oceans. That's rather clear. There's not a place I've been doing deep ocean surveys or even inshore where we don't find garbage, even miles down. And there's a clear sense that as we have left large numbers of ships and other things on the bottom, that as they deteriorate, that gets into the food chain and does come back. So the maritime landscape not only, I think, is an opportunity to reflect on what was. It's a chance to reflect on what may very well be. So that's how we're looking at our resources. It's not a new or previously unthought of thing. As I said at the start, we're building on what colleagues have done elsewhere, particularly in the National Park Service. But in applying it to the marine sanctuaries and at looking at potential expansion, not only in terms of how many shipwrecks we might document, but by looking at this whole concept of human response to the maritime world and to the oceans, I think we're going to be in a better place not only to manage, but also to connect to those folks, particularly in these communities who might otherwise not either have an interest or perhaps who might think that we don't have an interest. So with that, I'm going to close and go to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, James. So this is an opportunity now for folks to actually ask questions or post comments. You can do that quite easily by just typing them into the question answer chat box there at the bottom of your control panel. There's a few enough of us on the line that if you want to actually talk, you can just type in that you'd like to ask a question in that chat box, and I can open up the mics and let you actually address your question directly to James. And I kind of start, James, by asking you something that I've been kind of thinking about. As you kind of outlined several of the interesting themes that are there culturally along the coast to address, whether it be the mining, the timber industry, or surveying activities that occur there, or the life-saving activities and some of the events there. Do you have a favorite one of those themes that you traditionally use to kind of promote the idea of these marine sanctuaries, or that you see particularly effective at doing that in a compelling way?
I don't think there's any one category of resource or aspect of the maritime landscape that we usually call out in particular. I think for us, the key message we've been spreading with folks is that we're interested in all of it, and that we see in this a chance to hear from folks And I think it also, the fact that we're not just looking into the distant past, but we're looking at how people use these things today is continuity in terms of human activity. I think that helps. Where I'm particularly proud, though, I have to say, is in the work that's been done as of late with the native folks. Thanks to the partnership with BOEM and with work that's being done by Valerie Grussing in the Marine Protected Areas Center, which is part of the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, the work with those tribes on the coast has been powerful in understanding that the maritime landscape for them is not just the sea or the seabed, but the cultural resources for them are also the marine animals themselves. Whales have a particular totemic power and symbolic significance, and the harvesting of those whales is important to the macaw, of course, but to others. We're seeing this also play out in some work we're doing now in Hawaii, also with BOEM, to look at the maritime cultural landscape of the 8 main Hawaiian islands and also involve the native Hawaiian community. And that's not in the old traditional Margaret Mead way of tell me your stories and I'll write them down. It's by co-managing, by working with these folks actively and empowering them through the mechanism of the maritime cultural landscape to re-enter the dialogue that perhaps they might have hitherto been cut off of from decades or centuries of the colonial past and the renaming of their places.
Thank you. It's fascinating. These are very rich themes, kind of fun ones to talk about too. Let's pass along a question from Nancy Brown. Has NOAA documented this cultural landscape using the National Park Service methodology for cultural landscape reports?
We're just beginning to. We literally just started this over the last couple of years, but the plan is to do it in that way. But I also want to stress that for us, this is not just documenting it. We've really adopted this as our management approach. We use maritime cultural landscapes just as we use place-based management and ecosystem management to actively engage, not just in dialogue, but in actual feet on the ground, or at least, let's say, fins in the water, as we're out there. And I think you will see that over time. One of the things that I would direct folks to, and you can send a link out to it, is the Marine Protected Area Center with an advisory group came up with a tremendous white paper on maritime cultural landscapes, and we have been very proud to start to implement that and work with it, as well as to start to tie it in to the other areas. But so that's one thing to look at. But yes, in time we will be developing these, like the Park Service documents, the same type of studies.
Very good. It seems like there's a lag here. There's a couple of inquiries about the mailing list for the POET webinars, and also about whether or not the materials here today are going to be available afterwards. And I'll just acknowledge, yes, indeed, we do have a mailing list. Jim Pfeifenberger kind of maintains that, and so we'll make sure to get the word out. Certainly, any of you who wish to share the knowledge of these webinars, share them widely. All people need is access to the internet to access them, and lots of interesting information and fun presentations to participate in as well. Also, I'll mention that James has offered to make his PowerPoint available to us in a PDF form, and we've recorded today's session as well, and both of those will be available on a website following the presentation today. So if you missed part of it, want to hear more, certainly welcome to do that. That's great. Also, a question, kind of a follow-up comment from Nancy Brown here, that the CLR will organize the information in a way that assists with the management. It's not just a report that goes on the shelf, so it has some practical long-term benefit. Great. Thanks, Nancy.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? I think most of these are comments, folks. Small group today, but it does sound like we had lots of interest, and I have a sense that people will probably be log in and listen to this as well. Any, looks like things are tapering off. Do you have any final comments, or want to leave us with a thought here, James?
I think the thought I'd like to leave you all with is that as an archaeologist and as a resource manager, I'm very clear on the importance of interpretation and education. And if I, as a scientist, do my research in a way that doesn't get out to the public, if it's not compelling, it's not made interesting or connecting to you all, then I'm failing at my job. Interpretation is vital and key, and at every step of the way, the work that we're doing here at NOAA is powerful to our own educators as well as anybody else that we partner with. And so thank you all for the tremendous job you do so that the research that we're all doing gets out there to the public.
Well, very good, and thank you all for participating today. I'm not sure exactly when Jim has the next webinar scheduled. I'm sure he has a schedule of them. Even federal shutdowns don't keep us from our schedule of webinars, and I appreciate everyone's participation. Feel free to call or email if you have any follow-up questions. And once again, thanks, James, for your time today. And
thank you all.
Take care. Thanks.